Now we're wrapping up our conversation on imperialism with what are the legacies, both short and long term, of imperialism. So some of this we will not really finish up with here, but will be kind of a continuation that we will come back to following World War I and World War II when we talk about globalization, decolonization, and the Cold War. So to start off with, we know that the colonies continue to be export heavy with natural resources because that is the primary reason for why the Europeans, the Americans, the Japanese, and others are now partaking in colonization or imperialistic tendencies at this point in history in the later parts of the 1800s, early 1900s. It is to get market or get natural resources from places that they need in order to produce their manufactured goods. And then they will also be very import heavy with manufactured products to their respective empires. So because they're forced to essentially trade within their own empires, a place like India, which is a very big producer of cotton, can't necessarily just trade with the United States or China or Japan. It's controlled essentially by Great Britain at this point, which will change the status and the role of some places because previously India was a producer of cotton and clothes. Now, under the British rule, they are predominantly focused on cotton exports, while Great Britain is now the manufacturer of the clothes, and they have to do it at higher prices, which obviously hurts, the Indian manufacturers. So that means that they're going to be a now bigger importer of the stuff that they just sold off to be. So they're exporting cotton, but importing European clothes and textiles, and that is a trade deficit that keeps India kind of tied down to the British. And this is kind of, again, repeated throughout much of the industrial period and imperialism throughout all of these empires, just change the name and the location and probably the resources. In many cases, they force others to cut down and produce different crops. So within Sri Lanka or Ceylon, it's tea. Sumatra and Malaya with rubber trees. Iron smelting is no longer important within Africa because, again, manufactured iron and steel coming out of Europe and North America, again, is kind of diluting the need and the ability and the cost for those within Africa. So you can also think about the loss of skills and the artisan work that was, before this. Think about how that also affected, the guilds and cottage system, prior to, manufacturing, or when manufacturing came up, how that affected them. This is kind of a similar change. Okay. So in many other cases, we now see changing from subsistence farming to commercial and plantation farming. And in some cases, some of these places do really well, and so do the individuals, not necessarily Europeans who do well, based on levels of acumen, based on abilities in the marketplace. But for most, though, however, it's still kind of just one step up, where it's like you're working day in, day out, producing goods for these Europeans, for exporting bananas, for exporting cotton, exporting cocoa beans, tea, coffee. And then you have to import and essentially buy your goods from them at their rates. So not great, even if it's not necessarily subsistence agriculture where they're relying on growing crops for them families and possibly just trading with their neighbors. So this is where we begin to see a lot of places that are considered dependent. Think about going back to the ideas of the Wallerstein's world system theory or dependency theory, where the periphery or semi-periphery is being tied down and connected to the core countries, with Europe and Japan and the United States being the core and their colonies being the periphery. Okay, because they are the ones being forced to, work with under this system. So there's a loss of power and money for African merchants, then other merchants as well beyond there too, to European merchants and European financial firms. So again, those who had made money as merchants within their home countries are losing their power and authority as well as their wealth. We also see changing of gender roles because of subsistence agriculture and domestic duties. Women are focused on the subsistence piece, men now focusing on cash crops, mining, or urban factory jobs. So obviously men who are working in factories or in the mines, but have families on farms, will send that money back and they'll be gone for long parts of the year, while women are now pretty much left at home to, again, work both domestic and agricultural duties without a male family member or without their husbands with them. So again, women are more tied down to producing for the family, and while the male is out to produce for the money. So very stark differences there. Obviously, lots of uneven development based on the colony, the location, the type of economic production, the government that's kind of in charge. So some, again, do better, others are doing worse. And then, obviously, really ties down the idea of a global economy. But now, instead of, within Africa, predominantly, again, when we talk about historical trading purposes, India within the Indian Ocean trade, you have China with the Silk Road and everywhere in between. Um, that had been kind of the center, before the early to mid 1800s. India and China had been kind of the center of this trade and had made a lot of money on it. And Europe had slowly encroached upon that and slowly changed it, but it gets really, really big as a result of the Industrial Revolution and imperialism, where now Europe is the focus, Europe is the center, because they're the ones directing everything instead of what it used to be with China dictating the policies prior to, the opium trade. So, and then we also think about the changing of the environments, the increase of manufacturing, the increase of cutting down of trees and planting stuff, and one types of crops. Again, for commercial agriculture being done, so you can think about the environmental damage as a result, connecting to the Industrial Revolution, but also essentially we want you to make this crop and make more of it as an export for us. So cut down those trees, plant these out in the fields. We don't care what the damage is. And you can think about that also in terms of becoming economically dependent on Europe, similar to what we see also within Latin America. So within labor migrations, okay, is a very big piece here. Europeans had migrated predominantly before 1850s from Western Europe for farmland. Later Europeans are moving now for factory and mining work from Eastern and Southeastern Asia, or Southeastern Europe, not Asia. But at the same time, we also now begin to see a global migration within indentured servitude, which is something we had referred back to before as well. Many are moving to move for labor with their expenses paid. They get compensated as long as they work for a given number of years. Think back to indentured servitude within the United States, which had gone out again in the 1700s, but now is being used as a new form of labor, especially as slavery is ending on a global scale. So people are needed to work in the mines, in the fields, in factories. And so that's where a lot of these people are moving. So most are from India, okay, with all their large numbers out of China, parts of Africa, Japan, Indonesia, and many will work in tropical or subtropical climates. Think again, plantation agriculture, railroad construction, mining, with many of the women working as domestic servants. So again, that's kind of a global spread of migration at this point as a result, again, of imperialism and the Industrial Revolution. And then there's our mention again within Latin America. So other legacies. So focusing mostly on education. So we've kind of alluded to the fact that the Europeans will tell them kind of what kind of education models they want to have. So obviously we get Western style schools, oftentimes put in through Christian missionaries, but other times also put in forth by the government. So many now begin to see, especially if you were kind of the nobility, of the aristocracy of your community before the Europeans arrived, they now see Western education as a chance to, again, improve their status and improve their livelihood. Because for some, it will definitely increase literacy rates, access to better jobs, standards of living, income, health, social mobility, be more on the same footing with Europeans, even if it's not, obviously equal one-to-one. Hence why European education, why many are very accepting of it. When A, it's put down in front of them, and then B, because they see that this might actually allow them to move up under the European rule. Okay, so this will include, in many cases, not just for the social mobility and standards of living within European-style homes, European-style clothing, speaking the colonizer's language. So obviously the spread of English, German, Dutch, Belgian, German, Italian within different parts of the globe. Think about why is it in that many places within Africa the main language is English or French? Okay, it ties back to colonialism. All right, within India and Java and other places as well, education state supported and funded. In Africa, mainly through missionaries. So again, you think about access and how much they're investing their time and efforts. So again, think direct versus indirect here. Okay. In some cases, education and missionary work is the end, or trying to work again for more reform. So again, going back to the issue within India about ending sati, where the widows burn themselves on the funeral pyre of their husbands, ending child marriages, ending polygamy and female circumcision in Africa, with again varying levels of success through educational reforms. And we also begin to see more Christianity now syncretizing at higher levels within Africa, similar to what we've seen in the past. But not punishment for not following pure forms. So that is kind of lessened at this point. Yeah. And then obviously hope for development within many of these people to think, well, if we become Western, we act this way, we take on their role, act like them, follow their policies, maybe we can gain independence. And for some, that works well, but again, much more in the long term than the short term, such as the Indian National Congress, getting more levels of local authority and building up a political stratagem of nonviolent protests against the British rule, which again, it's building up in the 1870s and 1880s, but they don't become independent until the 1940s. There's again new tribal, ethnic, and religious affiliations. Some, again, in most cases, are pretty bad. Because this will be the definitive split within India between Hindus and Muslims, because many of the Indian Hindus view it as a religious nationalism, while many of the Muslims feel left out, which will obviously have very long-term negative implications. But also within Africa, we're now beginning to see the split between, within Rwanda as one case, between the Hutus and the Tutsis, between how they're being delegated and treated by the Europeans, who they're choosing to be in power with. And so, again, a lot of this comes down to very long-term negative outcomes, but some, again, positive in terms of responding to the European, institutions to eventually get themselves to be independent through nonviolent means. All right, but other legacies are not great. Here we have the Congo Free State treating the workers really, really poorly. So you have, King Leopold essentially in the what is that? I can't remember. In the something coils. I can't remember what it says anymore because that doesn't translate very well through that image. But then again, the loss and the deformities that are coming out of people working underneath the really harsh auspices of the Belgians. So there's a great video on there. It's 10 minutes worth your time to look at that. But then also the role of companies who are essentially instigating the idea of company rule, or putting this down to get a lot of money. So you can kind of see Lipton tea. They very much show off where they're getting it from as kind of this is a world extravaganza, so let's bring cultures with us, even if it's very much stereotyped culture for things like the World's Fair, the British Empire Games, things of that nature. But again, kind of showing off the value of the empire, including our hard workers who are part of our valuable empire. But yeah, so then you can now see again the changing women's roles for more women being forced to work out into agriculture again for products, and women doing most of the labor, the men doing the more mathematical higher up jobs as well. But again, not all the legacies are bad. Anti-cholera inoculation, okay, that's a good thing. Okay, better access to medical care. That's one of the very few bright spots of just imperialism is this. But again, what's the value of that in comparison to the loss of sovereignty, the loss of social status, the loss of culture? So things to definitely think about, but also inclusion of railroads, easier transportation, communication. But again, what are you replacing it with? What are you losing? You're losing, forestry. You're losing nature that was there before. Here's the migration map. Okay, with the population move. So you're seeing that movement within, Asia, particularly again, within India. So Indians moving into South America too. It's not really shown here, but again, into certain spots. And then again, for the indentured servitude piece. In this case, in terms of dealing with legacies of colonization, which I found this one in another different book, or not this, but the idea of it, that here is a statue of a German soldier in Namibia outside, I believe, the capital, or somewhere in the capital or near it, who died, or to commemorate German soldiers who died during colonization suppressing Namibian revolts, which is considered technically a genocide, and depending on who you talk to. But then the Namibians going, well, why do we have this? This is commemorating the colonizers and what they did to suppress our rights and freedoms. Why would we keep that up? So again, kind of dealing and grappling with those long-standing legacies. And then, negatives, here, increasing of Christianity, but at the loss of, again, those indigenous religions continuing, which is also within relation to expansion of Islam too. So yeah. So then other topics, other things you can consider looking at, great visuals here on imperialism within documents and visuals, white man's burden again. So yeah, something to consider within all the encapsulating ideas of both short and long-term issues within imperialism. And we'll continue with that as we get to World War I, and then also following World War II as well, dealing with the Cold War and decolonization and the effects that all this has resulting from nationalism, imperialism, industrial revolution, and beyond.